Hi there, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this month's Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force webinar. We are excited for today's in-house presentation by our very own David Dworkin and Tristan Breaux. Before we go ahead and do that, we are just going to go over some information coming out of NHC and some administrative stuff. So first, we want to make sure that everyone is aware of our upcoming Solutions for Affordable Housing event. It's our 2019 convening, and it will be happening on December 3rd and 4th at the National Press Club here in Washington, D.C. Please sign up for updates for the early bird registration. You can do that at www.nhc.org/solutionspolicies. As always for these we want to have a conversation. We want this to be a dialogue with you. And so we would love that if you have any questions that come up over the course of this presentation, that you ask them in the question box on the side of your GoToWebinar taskbar. At the end of the presentation, we'll make sure to leave time for some questions, and we will read those out and discuss them over here. So please put those questions in. If at all you have any issues with the GoToWebinar service, you can go to this website here for some support. And as always, there will be a link to view the presentation and download the slides that we are about to share with you today, emailed out to everyone who is registered. With that, I am going to turn it over to our two presenters. David Dworkin, who joined the NHC as President and CEO in January of 2018. Prior to joining NHC, David worked as a Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he advised Senior Treasury Department officials on matters related to housing and community development. Previously, David managed the Capital Magnet Fund at the Treasury's Department's CDFI Fund and served in a number of leadership positions at Fannie Mae. David brings a wealth of experience and expertise to NHC in areas including credit availability, housing finance reform, mortgage servicing, and affordable housing. Tristan Breaux joined NHC as a policy director in September 2018 and brings 10 years of policy and legislative experience, having most recently been the Deputy Chief of Staff for Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton. Tristan also worked for former Representatives John Spratt from South Carolina and Senator Kay Hagan from North Carolina, as well as on the House Budget Committee. Tristan also has professional experience in community engagement, having served as a Community Affairs Director for the Norfolk Sheriff's Office. The two of them today are going to be presenting on the national housing crisis and the need for a comprehensive National Housing Act. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Thank you, Nate. I really appreciate it, and welcome everybody. Because we had so much response to this webinar, I'm going to give a little background on kind of why we are planning a National Housing Act and why us. And so just a little bit about who we are. We have 266 members and growing. Every representation of the housing, affordable housing advocacy and housing industry communities. No more than 20% of our membership is actually in one sector. That's the nonprofit housing developers and intermediaries sector, which is 20%. But we also have members from the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks and JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America and Wells Fargo, to organizations like the MBA and the NAR and the Home Builders and the Multifamily Housing Council and CSHA, to organizations that represent civil rights groups like the Center for Responsible Lending and the NCRC and many, many others. And so the Coalition, National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and really just a span across the political spectrum. And that's a really important part of what we do, because we try to be the place where a diverse group of housers can come and get things done, work out differences there might be, and really consolidate and leverage our individual advocacy and really maximize the value of our diverse membership. And we've been doing that since 1931. And if you can see on the next slide that we were involved in the creation of the 1937 Housing Act and the public housing component of that. My favorite example is the letter from FDR to Senator Wagner, who drafted the bill, saying, when I get back from Warm Springs, we should talk about affordable housing. And then at the bottom is a note to Eleanor Roosevelt, who our founder worked very closely with in the settlement housing movement in New York in the teens and 20s, saying that this refers to, NHC's request. And then the Fair Housing Act, we were very involved with. We advocated for the creation of HUD for 10 years. The 68 Housing and Development Act is a big one that we were very engaged in. And really the last comprehensive National Housing Act. We've had a variety of housing bills since then that have looked at components, but we're basically still working off of a 50-year-old architecture in terms of federal housing policy. And so that brings us to the issues that really argue for a National Housing Act for the 21st century. And we're going to go through just quickly some of the issues that drive this. You can see this is a supply-driven shortage. And when we look at single-family starts, for instance, a typical average of single-family starts was around 1.3 to 1.4 million on a running basis up to the run-up to the crisis. Clearly, it increased then to not a sustainable level. But then we have an 80% drop in single-family starts, and that has an enormous impact on both families who are homeowners and potential first-time home buyers, but also on renters, because when you have a massive drop in housing production on the single-family side, you increasing the pressure on the rental housing stock because you have more and more renters, and the more renters you have, the higher rents are if you're not building an equal amount of additional multifamily housing, and that's what we've seen. And so very quickly, just a few examples of this from our Paycheck to Paycheck database. Here in Washington, D.C., you can see that a wide range of occupations from relatively low and moderate income to higher income, including accountants and carpenters and legal secretaries, cannot afford to buy a house with either 10% down or 3% down. And but it's not just markets like Washington. You look at Nashville, Tennessee, you can see that nobody in these job categories can afford to buy their own home in Nashville either. And then just for the point of kind of showing where the extreme is, you can see in San Francisco, we actually broke the graph in San Francisco. You need to be making $390,000 in San Francisco to put 3% down on a typical home there. And you can see that even if you had two accountants and a carpenter living as a throuple, they still would not be able to afford to buy a home in the San Francisco area. There just is no combination here that works for anybody who isn't being paid, really incomes that don't put you in the top few percent of the country. And the result for all of this is not unexpected. When you look at home ownership, every group has seen a significant decline in their home ownership. And when we really can argue that we should be seeing home ownership rise rather than fall, the blue line here is the overall national total, but we really have a hard time when we look at the numbers like this, looking at individual racial and ethnic groups, because it's so flat, because the white line is so high. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tristan, who's going to talk a little bit more about what we've learned in this space and what we're doing.
Thanks, David, and thank you all for joining us for this important webinar. And one of the things that we've noticed, we've identified at NHC is how do we identify the problem as it relates to Black home ownership. In this particular graph that you see now, through the 90s, you saw continuous growth in pretty much all races. Of course, in the early 2000s, you see that plateau within the Black community, and that continuously going down, throughout the 2000s up until this point that we have now in 2019. It continued kind of other areas. You had the white, and you also have non-Hispanic white and Hispanic, and of course the average continuing to go up and peak a little bit. But the African American home ownership just continued to go down and continues to go down. That's where it is now. The next slide that we have, what we did was we placed everyone on the same level in the 90s. So everyone started at zero. It would be, in a perfect world, we would love to have folks start at the same line. But in comparison to see what the trends were between 94 and, of course, now 2019, what you see is, of course, again, that same continuous growth throughout the 90s, but that huge drop in Black home ownership running up into the crisis and, of course, right after the crisis. We've now identified through NHC's working group that is a particular area that not many individuals have focused on as it relates to fixing the problem and what the narrative should be of how to fix the problem. And so that's where we've created a coalition of folks to figure out how do we address that plateau when Black home ownership is lower now than in 1968, when it's actually legal for people to be denied a mortgage based upon the color of their skin.
And one thing I would just jump in here to add, Tristan, is that we see this plateau in the Black community, and it really raises the question of why, during the run-up to the crisis, are we not seeing a comparable increase in home ownership? And the reason we think is that in the Black community in particular, there's a very high concentration of equity stripping occurring. So while you would see similar trends in terms of mortgage volume, in the Black community, homeowners who got safe loans in the 90s are actually being refinanced into toxic loans. And that is part of the reason we suspect that so many African Americans today are so reluctant to get back into the mortgage game, because in fact their experience was so targeted at taking advantage of them, and that creates a marketing as well as a civil rights component of this.
Definitely. And as David said, what some of the things that we found to be the problem, there are a couple of different contributing factors, and even more possible ways of how we can address them overall. As we do know, there's no silver bullet to fixing housing, period. There's definitely no silver bullet to how do we fix the Black and minority home ownership gap that has many different issues. As David stated, those African Americans who lost their homes, they were refinanced out of really good loans that they were comfortable with and that worked for them into toxic ones. Cash out refinancing, a huge issue. Equity stripping, definitely a huge issue. And so figuring out how to address community development overall, the worst part of the recession was that in historical Black communities, that drove up vacancies, that drove up blight, like we see in Detroit, drove up a lot of different, it broke communities, Black communities pretty much in half. And so what we're doing is looking at how do we address key parts of this, and how do we address the narrative. We have to instill confidence back into the Black community. That's number one. Looking at what products were not good, what products worked, how do we bridge that gap of the trust factor of a trusted advisor in the Black community. There are 1.7 million mortgage-ready Black millennials across the country right now. Those individuals who are making over $100,000 a year, and they're ready for a mortgage today, but they're renting. And if you were burned, if your grandfather was burned, if your father was burned, then you already have a trust issue. And so how do we address that? How do we address student loans? Student loans is a huge concern with Black millennials and millennials in general, but particularly with Black millennials, because we're spending that amount of money as well as the cost of rental housing to address, and there's no ability to save any type of money. Our overall Black homeownership working group, that is a subset definitely of our affordable homeownership group within the National Housing Act, is identifying a couple of different ways. Changing in mortgage underwriting, as you can see, reducing the cost of originating and servicing small dollar loans, particularly as it relates to Detroit. David's one graph that we have, of course, is of Nashville, so the Southeast region is huge as it relates to Black community and small dollar loans. Improving FHA and conventional rehab loans, increasing overall production of affordable housing. We know that rental fees are a huge issue, and so how do we increase affordable housing across the board and the ability to decrease those rental fees and those rental costs, and so that they can have some form of savings. Changing in how we conduct homeownership counseling, make sure that we're doing before and after. We oftentimes say at NHC, we taught how to build wealth in the 90s, but we didn't teach how to keep it. And so that's an important thing of making sure that counseling is before and as well as after. Modernizing the marketing approach. As I said before, there's a trust issue. Historical underserved communities don't trust the financial system, and so how do we modernize the marketing strategy to the community is going to be important. And of course, Gse Reform, which is a huge conversation with Fannie and Freddie, making sure that they're committed to communities of color through their programs such as Duty to Serve Black approaches.
And before we move on to the next part, there are just a few people asking if we could expand upon what you all mean by equity stripping. Be helpful since we're just
Sure. This is a great question. And, when we talk about the value of homeownership, we talk about the ability to build wealth, which is the equity in your house. It starts with the money you make as a down payment, and then it continues to grow as you pay down your mortgage and as housing prices rise. And eventually you go from having 3 or 5% equity to having 10 or 20. You get out of your mortgage insurance, maybe you get a bonus and make some extra payments, and eventually you're able to pay off your mortgage and you have 100% equity. And along the way, particularly in a rising rate environment, it's tempting to be able to do a cash out refinance where you lower the amount of equity you have in order to get cash out of the house. And there are times when that's exactly the right thing to do. Maybe you need to do an important structural repair in the house that's more expensive than you budgeted for.
Send a kid to college.
Maybe you need to send a kid to college. Retirement is something we talked about. And those are appropriate ways to pull out equity. But paying for credit cards, going shopping, taking a wanted trip, those are things that really depreciate the value of the homeownership experience and ultimately expose you to shocks that you may not be prepared for in keeping your house. And what we saw in the crisis was a really concerted effort, particularly by mortgage brokers, to target African-American neighborhoods and homebuyers to refinance out of an FHA loan or a Fannie Mae loan or a Freddie Mac loan into a subprime loan that might have a teaser rate that was really low. They would get cash out, they would get a low payment for a couple years, and then the payment would reset to a rate they couldn't possibly repay, so they would get what I call serial refinancing, and each time you take more equity out to pay the increasing cost of the refinance. They tell you it's a no cash refinance. It really just means no cash out of your pocket. And then when the recession hit, a lot of families who should have had significant equity and the ability to make it through found that they were very quickly underwater, and they were really collateral damage in the mortgage crisis. And the popular narrative was that the crisis was caused by people getting bad mortgages to buy houses that they couldn't afford. And there was certainly plenty of that, but it was not the case in the African American community. And it's very important for us to understand that and look at it as a unique experience that needs to be addressed in ways that in many cases will help everybody, but in particular needs to be studied very closely and mitigated in the Black community.
And so the next part is the bill is addressing affordable rental housing. As we said before, you can't really talk about home ownership without talking about the fact that the cost of rental has gone up dramatically over the years. The graph that we're showing now shows that there's a significant issue with rental housing. Income has not kept up with income hasn't kept up with rental fees. And so basically you're continuing to make less or make the same, but your rental costs are continuously going up. We oftentimes, again, say at NHC, housing is a continuum. And so you have fewer homeowners, you have more renters. When you have more renters, you have higher rents. When you have higher rents, ultimately you have a larger homeless population, which is unfortunate across the board. Paycheck to paycheck, our paycheck to paycheck report, as David indicated on the homeownership side, looking at the rental side, Washington, D.C. is oftentimes the first place to go, looking at housing costs. As you can see, there is no way anyone in any of those categories can afford a 3-bedroom apartment. And if you are married with 2 kids, both of the opposite gender, a boy and a girl, you're probably going to need a 3-bedroom apartment, and you can't afford said 3-bedroom apartment. You can barely afford a 2-bedroom apartment with any of those careers. Moving to Nashville, you have somewhat of a better situation, but not much of one, because you still cannot afford, if you have a home health aide, cannot afford any of a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, or a 3-bedroom apartment. Even a bank teller who gives us money can't afford to live in the area for 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, or 3-bedroom apartment. And of course, the Alcatraz, as I like to call it, San Francisco area. This particular one is interesting, and I look at it as if you are an accountant and you're married to a legal secretary, and let's say that you're counting the money and you're keeping up with the books of a lawyer, and your spouse is the legal secretary making appointments for that same lawyer. You got 2 individuals working for one lawyer. Put those incomes together, they still cannot afford a 3-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. Together, they'll make a little under $155,000 a year, and they would have to make $160,000 a year to afford a 3-bedroom apartment. So 2 individuals, 2 incomes combined, who are working for one individual cannot even afford a 3-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, which I find very, very interesting, and we see all too often across the country. That continuum continues to go down. When you have less homeowners, you have more renters, and more renters, you have higher rent, and you have higher rent, you have this conversation. You have the homelessness issue. And so ending homelessness is important for us. We can't talk about housing, period, if we're not putting individuals in homes. And as you can see on this chart, homelessness does not discriminate against any state because there's an issue all across this country as it relates to homelessness. Most of these states, actually probably all of them, but I can definitely say most of them, already have some form of affordable housing programs. So we're stepping in the right direction, but clearly because of those numbers, as you can see, of course, New York and California being those outliers there, there's not enough. The numbers show there's not enough of affordable housing across the country because we wouldn't have numbers as largely as we do across the country. If you look at New York and you look at particularly in San Francisco, 2 areas that I think has been very liberal leaning as it relates to housing policy. We have to identify what the number is to address homelessness overall. What is the number to where we're putting individuals in fully sheltered homes or rental units, or not transitional, not within shelters, but actually in places that they can call a safe space to be. And so what that number is something that's very important to NHC. I'm sure it's very important to our homeless advocates, but that's the purpose of this particular part of the bill, to figure out what the number is so we can end this indictment on housers and addressing our homeless population. And with that, I'll actually let Nathan continue the conversation because he is definitely leading the charge on this particular topic as it relates to NHA.
Thanks, Tristan. And so I just want to point to this graph that's coming out of research done by Zillow. So it's showing the rate of homelessness based off of the share of income spent on rates. This is looking at homelessness as is related to how much people are paying to rent and live where they are. And so we see this general through line between 20% and up to 32%, this upward trend. And once we hit 32%, folks who are spending 32% of their income on renting their home, the rate at which these folks are experiencing homelessness actually increases beyond the trend line that we see prior to 32%. And so this is particularly concerning as it relates to the continuum that Tristan is discussing. If we don't have affordable housing and we have the general, measure that people use for affordability of 30% of income spent on housing, if we don't have enough affordable housing, then we're going to, you see an even greater rate at which people are at risk of experiencing homelessness. So to put a few numbers to this, when we look at the homeless population, it's there's various types of subgroups that we estimate or that we use to analyze data. So looking at veteran homelessness, family homelessness. One of the groups is the chronically homeless. So chronically homeless are individuals who have been, are individuals with a disability who have been continuously homeless for 1 year or more, or have experienced at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the last 3 years. That combined length of time is at least 12 months. And the chronically homeless folks cost the taxpayer an average of $35,000 per year. This is in part because there is a need to use, or they cost supportive services or crisis services, such things like shelters, hospitals, jail, and prison. So this is in part where these costs are coming from. Supportive housing, on the other hand, 1 unit of supportive housing on average costs $12,800. And supportive housing is when we provide both a housing subsidy and case management and supportive services to individuals. And this plays into the more recent Housing First approach, which has been shown as a cost-effective method for addressing homelessness. So supportive housing reduces the cost of chronically homeless to taxpayers by nearly 50% on average. And to flesh this out with some more numbers, in 2018, there were nearly 90,000 individuals experiencing chronic homelessness across the nation. And so the cost of the chronically homeless, based off of the numbers from this slide and the last, gives us about $3 billion. Whereas the cost of supportive housing that could be used to house these folks who are chronically homeless is about $1 billion. And that means that the cost savings of ending chronic homelessness alone, not to mention looking at what would it mean to end homelessness for the over 500,000 individuals experiencing homelessness nationwide, is $2 billion. And so like Tristan mentioned, we are looking to work with our members to determine what the cost would be to end all homelessness and what the cost savings would be.
And I think this is really important because it's not just about the chronically homeless. Chronically homeless has always been difficult to address, and it's a complicated area. But if we were to actually commit an additional $2 billion a year the right way with some innovative programs, we could make a huge impact on that. And that's just the point where you have a net gain of 0 and a net cost of 0. When you look at the entire spectrum, taxpayer is actually breaking even in this case. But we also have a huge growing problem of economic homelessness. And I always say that, economic homelessness is an indictment against every single thing that every one of us is trying to do in affordable housing, because there shouldn't be any. And so it's we're not succeeding. It's not that we're not trying hard. We are. We're not getting enough resources. We are not being audacious enough sometimes about what we're asking for. There are all these competing pressures on us, and but at the end of the day, we should not have anybody in this country who climbs out of a car or a tent, washes up in a bathroom, and goes to work all day and comes home to do the same thing again. And I think that's really a driver for all of us, and a focal point. And there's also some opportunity in it, because I think it's really embarrassing for many Americans that this even exists, particularly with the working homeless and families. And that's just not the kind of country we've had in the past, not since the New Deal, and it's not the kind of a country I want to be in today. And the way we're going to address that is by fixing it, and that's what we're trying to do here. So let's move into community development, and this is a big area. We're going to tackle just a few things here in more detail, but the community development team that we're going to be talking about, how we put together these teams, is really going to be thinking about this much more broadly and whiteboarding some new solutions, talking about how to fix current policies. But one of the things that's been proposed are opportunity zones. They're in place now. Secretary Mnuchin has suggested we could end up with $100 billion of investments a year. NCSHA has calculated in July of 2019, there are already 163 funds seeking to raise $43 billion. The reporting requirements for opportunity zones are really inadequate to make an informed assessment of the opportunity zone program, and the potential for incenting significant displacement of low and moderate income residents remains quite significant. And it's important that we're able to know exactly where and how much of that is occurring. I like to say, gentrification is often defined very differently by different groups of people, but the bottom line is we do want investment in low-income communities. We want jobs there, we want investment, we want increased taxpayer dollars, but we also want to ensure that the people who are really the heroes of the neighborhood, who have stood by their neighborhoods, are not displaced by the changes. We want them to benefit from it. A couple of reasons why these problems get magnified and leveraged. Zoning restrictions has got a lot of attention. It's one of the few things that's really had bipartisan attention. Secretary Carson has raised it. Senator Warren has raised it. Any number of folks in between. And and this is a problem that really, we talk about exclusionary zoning. It's a problem that builds on itself. And the higher property values go because of exclusionary zoning, the larger the incentive to keep those exclusionary zoning rules in place. And you just end up with a bigger and bigger delta between the haves and the have-nots. Residents who typically oppose new housing and attend local zoning and planning meetings are often homeowners. They're often longer-term residents, which gets to my other point. They're usually older and often white men. And so as a white man, there's nothing wrong with being a white man, but I don't need to be arguing against zoning rules that make it easier for other people to live in my neighborhood, and I don't. On the next slide, we look at cities and states are debating a variety of approaches to exclusionary zoning. We have a really aggressive bill in California that died in committee again in May, and now they're trying to address it through rent control. That has a whole host of unintended consequences that come with that, and a mixed record of success. So, and the way I look at it is this rent control bill really is a poor cousin to the effort to address the exclusionary zoning problems. And We don't need rent control if we're building enough housing and rents are controlled by the market. And so if you're going to argue for a market rate response, you have to have market rate investment, and when we don't. In Oregon, they banned single-family zoning. We're going to see how that plays out, how it works, and the impact it may or may not have. Massachusetts has drafted legislation. In Seattle, they've upzoned 27 neighborhood hubs. Minneapolis, they've also banned single-family zoning. New York City has been tackling this. There is bipartisan support for federal incentives to address local regulations and zoning. But I think one of the things that's very important to keep in mind here is that taking away community development block grant funds, which are a tool for creating affordable housing, because you don't want to create affordable housing, probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I think we really need to focus much more on transportation dollars and other forms of federal subsidy that go into communities that are popular and that people want, and say, if you're going to get this federal support, you're going to have to address these zoning issues. And when you're going to make that kind of carrot and stick approach, the carrot has to be something that people actually want to eat. So with that, we're going to turn it back to Nathan and talk a little bit about climate impact, and we'll be moving along here so that we have time to talk about the process moving forward, as well as take your questions. So Nathan?
Yeah, so climate impact is the final part of the National Housing Act. So in 2018, we saw, or I guess to back up a little bit, we at the National Housing Conference are not particularly positioned to engage in the conversation that's happening at this national level of what will the impacts of climate change be in the future, whether it's happening or not. What we know is that the impact of the climate is affecting the nation, and it's affecting homeowners across the country. In 2018, we had 14 natural disasters that caused $1 billion or more each, for a total combined damage nationwide of $225 billion. And so on top of this, only 60% of those damages were uninsured. In 2019, we've had recent coverage of tropical storms Karen and Dorian, but in the spring season, we saw record flooding over 150 consecutive days throughout the Midwest, which has affected 14 million people and has an estimated cost of at least $12.5 billion. And there have already been 6 events, including that flooding event, that have also cost over $1 billion, including 4 severe storm events. So we know we have the facts in front of us that regardless of the debates around climate change, that the climate is impacting everyday Americans, and it's costing us money. So this is just a graph to show the number of billion-dollar disaster events and their frequency. The black line at the bottom is the average over the past 40 years, and you can see that in the past 10 years, almost every year has actually been far beyond that average. And so we need to make sure that we are addressing housing from the lens of climate, because if we don't, we're going to be making decisions that are blind to the fact that our homes and our infrastructure are going to continue to be damaged by the climate. So for every $1 invested in disaster mitigation, we actually save $6 in disaster recovery costs, which is great. But the federal agencies that are in charge of disaster mitigation funds disproportionately fund post-disaster mitigation as compared to pre-disaster. So you see that 90% of federal flood risk reduction funds are tied to specific presidential disaster declarations, meaning that it's not until the president declares that there has been a disaster in a certain area that those funds are accessible. And 84% of FEMA mitigation funds occur post-disaster. So in all this conversation, we also want to be thinking about how can we be proactive instead of reactive about how we are making sure that the homes that people are living in are safe and can withstand natural disaster.
And I would just add one more point before we go on, which is that the debate over climate change is very frustrating to those of us who recognize the enormous amount of science that exists on the reality of climate change, particularly that tracks with changes in human behavior. But I think that a lot of what is a pretty significant minority of people in the United States and around the world who are resistant to accepting these arguments is because their livelihoods are so dependent on a fossil fuel society in which we currently live in. And the potential for enormous economic disruption underlies a lot of the proposals that we're talking about in the climate change arena. And people take that very personally because it impacts them very personally. And so I think that a level of sensitivity as we make some of these arguments more broadly is really valuable. But from NHC's perspective, we're not experts in this area. This is not really covered in our mission in terms of climate change and the strategies to mitigate it and reverse it ultimately. The climate impact is happening right now, and it is disproportionately affecting both housing and low and moderate income people. And so by focusing on the impact, we're hoping that we can have move the dial, at least in that space, and work with our members who are prioritizing that area. So that brings us to the National Housing Act and what we're really trying to do here and why your involvement is so important to us. We've identified 5 areas that we've talked a little bit about the problem that we think really constitute an omnibus affordable housing act for the 21st century. And to really address this crisis, we have to look at all of them. There are significant overlaps, as we've talked about through the presentation, that are essential that we address. We also need to step off of our comfort zone. You know, one of the areas that we've been really supportive and engaged in is the low-income housing tax credit. There's legislation now being considered that many of us are advocating for to increase the low-income housing tax credit allocation by 50% and to fix the 4% so that it's actually 4%. But the reality is we may need 2 or 3 or 4 times bigger allocation. And so we've come up with that 50% number because we think it's realistic to get this year. But we also, we believe, need to make the case, if we're going to look at a comprehensive approach to this, of what do we actually need to solve the problem? What is the maximum capacity of the low-income housing tax credit? And if it's 200%, we need to say that, and we need to say that, you know, you can do half of this, but you're going to solve half of the problem in this space. And in other areas, there are plans that are being discussed, like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is now building co-sponsors, and which are new approaches that we need to advocate for. And then there are plans and programs and reforms that people have in their minds, among all of you who are experts in this, that aren't even on our radar, and we need that on the list too. So we have identified these 5 subgroups and appointed 10 co-chairs to each, and you see them listed here. Steve Thomas from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago and Chris Siglin from NCST. You can see Buzz Roberts and Rachel Fee in affordable rental, Nan Roman and Catherine Monet on ending homelessness, Marion McFadden and Sean O'Shaughnessy from to address the climate impact issues, and Matt Josephs and Wendy Jackson to look at community development. You know, LISC and Enterprise have been really big leaders in this, and so they bring a lot to the table. Shauna, for example, is from Northern California and really was in the midst of the fires. They had a significant multifamily unit that burned to the ground. They really have seen a climate impact up close and personal. Wendy has been leading the Kresge's effort in Detroit and really has a fine-tuned understanding of where public dollars and private dollars come together, where they leverage each other, and where the comparison suggests that we really need to address some of the private money to make it more impactful. Moving forward in the third quarter of this year, we're looking at finalizing the work of the subgroups. They have the co-chairs, which we've done. We've assigned staff. Each co-chair and subgroup have initially met with NHC staff and will be calling for brainstorming sessions on root issues and statistics, past legislation, and coming up with new legislative programs that we should be thinking about. We're clearly going to be looking closely at the Millennial Housing Report and the BPC report, because there's been a lot of work here we don't need to duplicate. We need to go back through those and weigh them carefully. And then the purpose of this is not to negotiate with ourselves. We want to come up with everybody's ideas, and then we're going to have to really work within our policy committee and the co-chairs and ultimately our board to come up with a comprehensive and cohesive package that we think can actually get enacted. And that's where some of the difficult trade-offs may need to occur, because we believe that to actually enact the National Housing Act, we're going to have bipartisan support for it. And in this space, how I've come to define bipartisan support is 25 to 30% Republican is co-sponsorship, really gives you credible claim to bipartisanship, doesn't need to be 50-50, but if you get below 20, it's harder to make that case. And so what would it take to get there? And as the problem continues to escalate, we're seeing more and more Republicans start to pay attention to this. In the first quarter, the board will work through these and come up with a legislative outline, and then we'll publicly launch, potentially in a primary state, and really spend the rest of the year socializing and politicizing this plan, this National Housing Act, which will start as an outline, and then we'll start to build out more details as we work with a broader group and with members of Congress. We'll do this work in House races, Senate races. We want to have a reference to this in both the Republican and Democratic platforms, and obviously among presidential candidates. So by the end of the year, there's really broad support for having a National Housing Act and significant bipartisan support for our approach. And I think that tees us up. Our goal on this is H.R. 1 in 2021. That's a very ambitious goal. I like to say, you know, I'm shooting for H.R. 1 in 2021 and getting it passed in the next Congress, but I will be perfectly happy if we're able to do this in 3 or 4 years of advocacy. Many of these proposals could take 10 years. We advocated for the creation of HUD between 1955, when we first introduced the idea, to 1965, when the bill was signed. And I have the signing pen on my wall, and I'm looking forward to another one, as I assume many of you will too, once we actually succeed in this. So that's our story. We're going to stick to it. And with that, we're going to open it up to questions that folks have from around the country. Thank you all.
Great, and we definitely have a number of questions. So for folks who are still tuning in, please feel free to submit your questions in the little chat box on the side. I guess we can start and open it up first with just a question about Gse Reform. I know that there's been some things coming out of NHC here, and it would be great if maybe we could expand upon what the role of Gse Reform is as it connects to homeownership and housing affordability.
So just very briefly, there's a couple things I've written about this, an op-ed recently in The Hill, which you can see on our website, and our Gse report, which we put out a couple weeks ago. I think the most important thing for in the affordable housing space is that despite the language of the report, which you know, it required a certain amount of red meat for conservatives, given it's a Republican administration, Secretary Mnuchin was very clear at the hearing when asked about this. He said, "I support the affordable housing goals and the duty to serve." It was a pretty definitive statement. Mark Calabria has made similar definitive statements about that. I'm going to hold them to that. But also they recognize that any change in the affordable housing goals requires the support of both Senator Brown and Chairwoman Waters. And I'm certainly happy for them to be my proxy on this, but we're going to hold them accountable as well. That gives us enormous negotiating position. The rest of the conversation really revolves around how we maximize liquidity and have appropriate standards for capital that do not constrain the affordable housing market. And that's where a lot of this is going to be taking place. And we're happy to have you engaged in that, and send me an email if you're interested in discussing this in further detail.
Great. There's a few questions to do with Black homeownership. So first, if we could discuss how NHC is engaging with the members and others on Black homeownership and what that process looks like.
Sure. One of the things that is very evident is that Urban Institute has done a lot of research around Black homeownership and has done a lot of research on the trends in Black homeownership. The civil rights organizations, the NAACP and the Urban Leagues, particularly the Urban League, has called on the administration as well as Congress to address the issue they've been advocating for on the civil rights spectrum for quite some time. NHC's role in this particular conversation is very unique, as we have a very diverse group of members. We're kind of the umbrella of bringing everyone together and having a conversation of how do we fix the problems. That's bringing the civil rights groups together with the banks. And it's bringing the banks together with the advocates. It's bringing the advocates together with the trade associations. It's bringing the trade associations together with the GSEs who are also trying to ultimately fix the problem. Bringing all these perspectives together and figuring out how do we address a problem that's pretty much, as the chart showed us, has been declining since the crisis and just a little bit before the crisis. And so our working group is a little bit different than what we've had before. We oftentimes say, again, David has said this a couple times, we don't need another study. We don't need another committee. We don't need to figure out what the problem is. And that's the primary purpose of the National Housing Act, particularly as it relates to Black homeownership and our working group, is we know what the problem is and how can we come together and how can we bring a coalition of folks together who may have different opinions of how to address it, and may have different opinions of what caused the crisis, or what may have different opinions of who we should focus on. But fundamentally, we have to figure out how to all work together to bring folks to the table and saying, how do we address this issue? What's the narrative going to be, and how do we increase, and how do we address those 1.7 million Black millennials who are mortgage ready today and get them from being renters, because we can move half of those out of the market of being renters. We possibly could be able to fix the problem of the high cost of rent, because the majority of them now have been moved out of the rental market. And so that's our particular standing of how do we address bringing all coalitions together and all parties together to have a real conversation of how we raise the market.
And we're really focused on, the research is incredibly helpful. We're going to continue to collect it, but this is an effort of maximizing our lenders' experience and moving the dial. And we want to move that number through specific, tangible strategies that have measurable results.
And so to build on that, there are a couple of folks asking just about if there's ideas around what kind of improvements to housing counseling or to marketing are being discussed or considered.
So I think the counseling question is really valuable. We've learned a lot about what kind of counseling works and what doesn't. Having people sit in a conference room watching a YouTube video is we know, is not impactful in ensuring their success in getting a mortgage or in being successful in their mortgage. Yet that occurred a lot during the crisis for loans that required counseling. One-on-one in-person counseling is a lot more expensive, but it's also a lot more impactful. And it creates a relationship that, if it is able to extend past the closing table, it can have an enormous impact on ensuring that the homeownership experience remains successful. And so one of the things we're looking at is how do we guarantee that when you sit at that closing table, if you worked with a counselor, the counselor can remain to be a part of the equation, that the lender, not being restricted by privacy concerns, but having your explicit permission on the front end. If you fall 15 or 16 days late, it's the counselor who calls you to say, how can I help? It's not the 1-800 number from the bank. Because if you're late, you are already under enormous stress, and those 1-800 numbers are not very inviting. And so for moderate income and low moderate income home buyers, once you've gotten 60 days late, it's almost impossible to catch up. So that intervention needs to occur and that communication right away. And we want to understand what is necessary to ensure that those counselors who need to be better funded to begin with, but can also get funded as part of the servicing relationship to ensure the mortgages get back on track quickly before they hit 90 days and have to be pulled out of a security and go into loss mitigation, formal loss mitigation.
And just to piggyback on that, I think it's also important to realize that going back to the conversation of who that trusted advisor is, particularly as it relates to the Black community. As a Black millennial myself, as I've told, I'm an elder Black millennial, the older of the bunch. For me, it's being able to have someone who has walked me through a process. And as David said, when if I'm falling behind or if I'm getting there, that's the individual that's calling me. And so it's having that trusted advisor relationship and being able to engage on the before, the during, and even the after, and understanding what home ownership means. And so not just focusing more so on the wealth side, but also just the investment of what it means to be a homeowner. And so that home ownership counseling and reevaluating what that is important. One of the main reasons why we're bringing Urban League to the table. Urban League has been doing this in the Black community for decades as it relates to home ownership counseling and actually having I think they have about 40 different branches all across the country in their states that are doing the housing counseling and investing in the communities. And so looking at what they've learned or the mistakes that they may have made or the successes that have been made, looking at people who have gone through the program, how we can expand upon that, how we can work together and bring that coalition together. So that's the importance that NHC has.
Great. And so I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. I'm going to wrap two together, but someone is asking to discuss a little bit more the idea around the maximum capacity of LIHTC, and I think as that kind of folds into figuring out the cost, how much of an increase in LIHTC you need, how much cost it would to solve XYZ problem, and then so maybe talk a bit about that approach to this initiative. And also as it ties to this larger momentum around housing that's been happening at the federal level. Someone was also asking about presidential candidates and their housing platforms, where this might fit in or see overlap or there.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts on this. But just to piggyback on what Tristan had said, we're also talking to the NAACP as well on how do we use trusted brands along with trusted lenders to create a scenario that is a healthy conversation and marketing approach that leads people to the right kinds of products, as opposed to what we had during the crisis with mortgage brokers who many people knew, but were financially incented to do the wrong thing. And so we need to have the right brand with the right incentives focused on helping people who have been underserved. On the LIHTC, I think one of the issues for me is that, and I spent a lot of time working on this at the Treasury Department, and then as I've come here, this may not be the most efficient subsidy compared to, say, 100% cash subsidy, but it is by far the most effective subsidy. And so we've learned a lot over the course of the low-income housing tax credit. We need to put all those lessons in place. The new legislation does some of that, but we also need to have a clear assessment of how much LIHTC can contribute to closing the shortage of affordable rental properties, and how big an allocation the existing industry can really handle, and what that number is. Is it 150% of the current total? Is it 200%? Is it 300? Where's that line? And that's the number we should start advocating. This year we're focused on a 50% increase, and I think that's really important, but we need to be very ambitious about this as well. And longer term, we need to be able to, whether we meet that 50% increase or not, we need to be able to understand what the number is we're really shooting for, and I believe we should be advocating for that. The other issue in terms of presidential candidates, and I think this really segues nicely into the work we're doing, is if I'm running for president, I'm going to have a partisan plan for housing. I am not concerned about who's going to co-sponsor my bill. I'm concerned about how effectively this is going to demonstrate my commitment to housing. Now, in that piece of legislation, and this is true of many of the different bills that are out there from presidential candidates, there are a lot of really good ideas that could gain significant support. There are other ideas that make a point, and that's valuable to their campaign. But we're going to be looking closely at these plans and figuring out, what we can take from them, what we can modify and adjust. But I think the fact that the candidates are all talking about this is a really important running start on ensuring that we can bring everybody together around a unified approach.
And just to piggyback off of David's on the presidential candidates, one of the unique things about there being 3,000 folks who are running for president on the Democratic side right now is that they all come from different areas of the country, and their perspective of issues are very interesting. And so looking at their particular housing policy as it relates to their parts of the country and the members, you all, that we have all across the country, and what you feel about those particular policy issues is going to be important. And there may be some overlap over time, but right now it's good to see what their plans are, because of course it's going to be very Democratic leaning. But particularly if you dig deeper into them, it kind of gets geographical. So whether you're coming from the Northeast, whether you come from the West Coast, whether you come from the South, those particular issues are going to be highlighted in their plans in some form or fashion. And so how we utilize that and how do we catapult that into a broader bill is going to be very important. And the last point I'll make is that housing hasn't been a sexy thing to talk about within the Democratic candidates or the Democratic debate side. And so it'll be interesting to see over time when they start to actually debate those plans, or over time, the questions that are asked or the pushback that they get, and how we engage with those particular campaigns are going to be important going into 2020.
That's right, and I have a lot of respect for the efforts to try to raise the profile of this among the debates. I think it's very hard to lobby reporters to cover things or to ask questions. And in fact, sometimes reporters and broadcasters can be very resistant to those efforts. We're trying to work behind the scenes to reach broadcasters who are engaged in this and make the case for asking questions about housing. And we also are asking our members to contact us and say, you know what, I've got a relationship, I've talked to this individual or that individual who may be a producer for one of the debate broadcasters or a broadcaster themselves, and let's strategize about how we might be able to make that case in a way they're going to be responsive to, because I think it is important that the questions get asked in the debate, and we need to be really strategic about how we get there, and I think all of these initiatives potentially can work well together.
Great, and with that, we are going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you to both David and Tristan for your time discussing these important issues with all of us. And amongst all the other things that are going to keep us busy here at NHC, we are going to continue this webinar series, which has a focus on community development, and we'd love to hear from all of you from across the country. If you know of local examples of good community development related work, please shoot me an email. On top of all the emails you'll be sending to sign up for our working groups, I'm excited for a very full inbox. And with that, we are going to leave you and look forward to seeing you all at next month's webinar. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.